Negotiation breaks out in Washington, despite the president's promise not to negotiate until the shutdown is over and the debt ceiling is raised. But what happens next? This is Special Report. Good evening, I'm Brett Baer. Two sides that seemed infinitely far apart just days ago now appear to be moving toward each other as we head into the second weekend of a partial government shutdown and a final weekend before reaching the debt ceiling. We have Fox team coverage tonight. Ed Henry is at the White House with how the president is straddling the fence of his no negotiations during the shutdown position. But we begin with Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel on Capitol Hill, where there is a sense of optimism tonight. Good evening, Mike.
Well, Brett, good evening. President Obama and Speaker Boehner had a late afternoon phone call, and both sides say they agreed to keep working to find a deal.
They're talking, and that's good.
A more hopeful tone after several weeks of heated rhetoric over the government shutdown. That after House Republicans offered to increase the debt ceiling for 6 weeks and reopen the government in exchange for spending cuts and entitlement reform. While House Republicans waited for a White House response to their offer, a spokesman for Speaker John Boehner said, quote, any House vote on a short-term debt limit bill is contingent on the White House and House Republicans agreeing to negotiations on a larger fiscal framework. Senate Republicans have their own plan, which would fund the government at sequester levels for a year and give agencies more flexibility under those spending cuts. It would also include repealing the medical device tax and measures to prevent Obamacare fraud. Today, the Senate GOP leader sounded interested in finding a deal.
Well, let's put this hysterical talk of default behind us and instead start talking about finding solutions to the problems. There are a variety of ways to get debt and spending under control. A lot of innovative reforms we should consider.
There are signs the American people are fed up with this standoff. A new Wall Street Journal NBC News poll asked if there were a place on your ballot that allowed you to vote to defeat and replace every single member of Congress, including your own representative. Would you do this or not? 60% of those surveyed said yes, while only 35% said no. The Senate Majority Leader said failure is not an option.
If we allow the United States to default on its debt, for the first time in our glorious history, it'll be a black mark on our reputation, and that is a gross understatement. It'll be a financial disaster, and it will spark a global recession.
Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins says she presented her plan to raise the debt ceiling through January and fund the government for 6 months, but says the president did not jump up and say that's a great idea. After the Senate Republican White House meeting, South Carolina's Lindsey Graham said a deal between the House GOP and the White House could get done in the next 48 hours.
I don't know what the House is going to do, but I'm of the opinion now that they will produce a product that will allow the government to be open for the entire year, that will have some changes to the Affordable Health Care Act. That's not a one-year delay.
Senator Graham says he's never seen the president so open to the idea of meaningful entitlement reform. Meanwhile, other Republicans say if Mr. Obama doesn't like their plans, it's time to unveil one of his own. Brett?
Mike Emanuel live on the Hill. Mike, thank you. President Obama is apparently negotiating over whether to negotiate. Chief White House correspondent Ed Henry reports from the White House very concerned tonight about optics.
White House aides declared the talks are in a far better place than just a few days ago and said President Obama was pleased with the phone conversation he had with Speaker John Boehner.
I had a good conversation, and the two of them agreed that all sides need to keep talking.
It sounds like the talking at the president's meeting with Senate Republicans, though, did not go quite as well.
He himself sort of chuckled about the grand bargain that he had been pursuing and that Speaker Boehner and others have been pursuing over the last few years. And he likened it to a unicorn. In other words, a mythical creature that no one's ever actually seen. That's what the grand bargain is, at least under this administration.
White House spokesman Jay Carney continues to play a game of semantics, insisting the president is technically not negotiating, but is speaking his mind behind closed doors with Republicans.
The senator should have expected the president to express his views on how we ought to move forward. I don't think Republican senators held back, or Republican House members have held back when expressing how, they think we ought to move forward.
A new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll found that when it comes to the president's strategy of not negotiating until the government is reopened and the debt ceiling is raised, 30% strongly agree and 10% somewhat agree with the president, though 36% strongly disagree and 7% somewhat disagree. Though the same poll shows there is far more pressure on Republicans to get a deal. Asked who is more to blame for the shutdown, 31% said the president, while 53% said Republicans in Congress, and 13% said they hold equal blame. Meanwhile, voters gave the Republican Party its lowest numbers in the history of Wall Street Journal polling, which dates to 1989, with more than twice as many people holding a negative view of the GOP as a positive one. A top Republican, Senator John McCain, used those numbers to suggest the White House has the upper hand in these talks by taking aim at Republican Ted Cruz's decision to filibuster the continuing resolution to keep the government open, which McCain says opened the door to big problems like the military death benefit snafu.
We shut down the government, and then that gave the opportunity for this to be terribly, awfully mismanaged and mishandled by the White House. If we hadn't shut down the government, this wouldn't have happened. And they shut down the government with a fool's errand that would not succeed, and that's a fact.
Now, there was also a sharp exchange behind closed doors between Senator Cruz and the president over his health care law. We're told the president was dismissive of those concerns behind closed doors, though Jay Carney would not comment on what happened. Brett?
We may learn more in coming days. Ed, thank you. Another positive day on Wall Street. The Dow gained 111. The S&P 500 was up 11. The Nasdaq finished ahead 31. For the week, the Dow was up a little over 1 percentage point. The S&P 500 gained 3/4 of a point. The Nasdaq was down about a half. The timing was, of course, coincidental, but in the midst of the government shutdown and the debt debate, many of the country's most enthusiastic conservatives are right here in Washington for a weekend political revival meeting of sorts. Chief political correspondent Carl Cameron on some of the people who are firing up the crowd.
Social and religious conservatives at the Values Voter Summit invited 3 key leaders in the GOP's push to defund the Affordable Care Act, reopen the government, and raise the debt ceiling in exchange for spending cuts. All are potential rivals for the 2016 GOP presidential nomination.
None of us know what's going to happen on this Obamacare fight right now. In my view, the House of Representatives needs to keep doing what it's been doing, which is standing strong.
Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, Rand Paul of Kentucky, and Marco Rubio of Florida were among the first to embrace the House's Tea Party-backed strategy of trying to derail Obamacare through the budget process. When liberal hecklers repeatedly interrupted Cruz, he brought the House down.
President Obama's paid political operatives are out in force today. And you know why? And you know why? Because the men and women in this room scare the living daylights out of them. And that is the model for every other fight.
Polls show the public blames the shutdown more on Republicans than Democrats, but Rand Paul was among the first to recognize that the left's refusal to negotiate would be viewed as unreasonable and redound against Democrats in the polls, too. But Paul barely mentioned the budget battles this morning, abandoning feisty partisan rhetoric to focus instead on mounting violence against Christians worldwide, a potent issue he often raises with religious conservatives who can sway GOP primaries.
But the truth is, a worldwide war on Christians is being waged by a fanatical element of Islam.
Marco Rubio, who's long fought to defund Obamacare, never specifically mentioned health care, the government shutdown, or the debt ceiling, lamenting a broader decline of traditional American values instead.
With all this fighting that's going on in Washington these days, my biggest fear is that we're losing focus on the biggest issues facing our country, that we're losing control of our nation, and more importantly, that we are losing what we've come to know as the American dream.
Another headline, 2012 Republican vice presidential nominee Paul Ryan canceled his in-person appearance to speak by videotape. The chairman of the House Budget Committee remained on Capitol Hill working on the GOP's new proposal for a 6-week extension of the deadline to raise the debt limit in order to start working on reopening the government and long-term entitlement reform.
That so-called grand bargain's been elusive for decades, so much so, in fact, that the political inability to find any middle ground is in part why Congress has been kicking the can down the road a few months at a time for the last several years, Brett.
So big applause for Michael Lee and Ted Cruz there.
but not so much for Rand Paul and Marco Rubio, who didn't engage on the issues of the day and focused on the kind of social issues that these types of gatherings are more accustomed to hearing.
All right, Carl, thank you. Up next, doing the math on what Obamacare is doing for or to Americans, depending on your point of view. But first, here's what some of our Fox affiliates across the country are covering tonight. Fox 9 in Minneapolis is covering the tragic death of the 2-year-old son of Viking superstar Adrian Peterson. The mother's boyfriend has been charged with aggravated assault. Fox 13 in Tampa with an outbreak of a bacteria that lives in salt water and has killed 10 people so far in that state. However, experts say the bacteria generally only affects people with compromised immune systems. And this is a live look at Chicago, our affiliate WFLD. The big story there tonight, preparations for the Chicago Marathon, the first since the bombing at the Boston Marathon last spring. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.
Judge Judy, live.